In October 2023, the SEC proposed a rule to approve the New York Stock Exchange's request to list natural asset companies. I led out on a letter to the SEC with 31 other members in the House expressing strong opposition to the process and the proposal itself. Thousands of stakeholders across the country wrote to the SEC in opposition to this proposal due to the surrendering of local control to elite investors, radical environmental groups, and even foreign governments. Briefly, NACs would have prohibited the, quote, unsustainable activities on public and private lands. In bureaucratic language, this is code for blocking all legitimate economic development, including energy development, food production, grazing, logging, and access to other raw materials needed for housing and industrial construction. In short, what NACs would do would be to allow someone like Bill Gates to buy the natural assets of, say, Shoshone National Forest in the state of Wyoming and block essentially all access, management, and use to that resource. But not just someone with billions of dollars such as Bill Gates. It would also allow China, Venezuela, Iran, Russia, other malign actors from purchasing the natural assets of these lands, both federal lands, BLM, U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service lands, but it also would apply to private lands or any private lands who had conservation easements on them. So those farmers and ranchers who had placed conservation easements on their property could wake up one day and be in partnership with the Chinese Communist Party. Obviously, this is something that was one of the most dangerous rules I have ever seen, and I am pleased that the New York Stock Exchange saw the light and withdrew it. But Mr. Wyomingites, I just have a couple of questions for you. I know you weren't involved in the SEC's proposal, but I'm highlighting these concerns because the BLM is responsible for the management and mismanagement of these resources on 10% of this country's acreage. And I can't even imagine that the BLM would think that the SEC's or the New York Stock Exchange's proposal was appropriate or that it would be a good thing to do. Do you know whether the BLM weighed in with the SEC challenging the SEC or the New York Stock Exchange's ability to sell the natural assets of BLM lands?
Congresswoman, my understanding is that the department has been clear that we had no engagement with the SEC on this proposal.
So you had no engagement with the SEC at all? The SEC never contacted the BLM and said, we're going to sell your, or the New York Stock Exchange? They didn't contact you and say, we're going to sell the natural assets to the BLM lands?
Congresswoman, I have to refer you to the SEC for how they go about their public comment processes.
No, I'm asking the BLM.
As I noted, the department has had no engagement with the SEC on this withdrawn proposal.
Interesting. Did you call them up and say, we don't like this idea?
Again, Congresswoman, we have not had any engagement with the SEC on this withdrawn proposal.
Why don't you think that the BLM should weigh in on this proposal that would have sold all the natural assets to the BLM lands to, say, China?
Again, I'm not familiar with the content of the proposal,
So
only
the
from what
BLM
I've
is
read in the
just not
popular
taking
media.
a position?
But
The BLM is just...
we in all our land management work are committed to following the law and meeting the tenets of our multiple use and sustained yield mandate.
Okay, Mr. Wyomingites, do you believe that just perhaps our foreign adversaries would have a reason to cripple our access to raw materials needed for legitimate economic development? Don't you think that would be something that our foreign adversaries would want?
Congresswoman, I'm here today to represent the Bureau of Land Management, so that's outside of my area of expertise.
Well, the BLM is where we access coal and oil and gas. It's where we have grazing rights and trona. It can't be outside of your expertise. That's what we do on our BLM lands.
And certainly we're committed to meeting all those multiple uses on the public lands through our management.
In the case of the New York Stock Exchange's proposal, they didn't include any kind of investment exclusion for foreign adversaries. In fact, the Intrinsic Exchange Group, who worked closely with the New York Stock Exchange, explicitly stated that foreign governments could invest in these NACs. They're not just okay with it, they actually extended the invitation. So I think that that's of grave concern and something that the American people should understand, that the New York Stock Exchange, along with the SEC, were inviting foreign governments to come in and purchasing, for example, the natural assets associated with all of our BLM lands. But I also think it's important for the American people to understand that the BLM did nothing to push back on that kind of a radical idea. Thank you for that opportunity. I have so many questions for the BLM. 48% of the surface estate in the state of Wyoming is owned by the federal government, and about 65% is owned, of our mineral estate is owned by the federal government. So when those resources are mismanaged, it has an enormous impact on my state and the citizens of my state. And when you have programs such as the 30 by 30, what you now call America the Beautiful, which I would vehemently disagree with because I don't believe that that's ultimately what will happen with those efforts, I think you'll see what we have been seeing over the last several years, which is the continuing of catastrophic forest fires for failure to properly manage our National Forest Service lands. Removing grazing from our BLM lands is going to have very serious impacts not only on the economy throughout the state of Wyoming, but it will impact the quality of those lands and the grasses as well. So I'm going to talk to you specifically about some of the things that the BLM has been doing in the state of Wyoming. In mid-August of this last year, the BLM Rock Springs Field Office introduced their draft resource management plan for revision for the Rock Springs planning area, which makes up 3.6 million acres of land in the state of Wyoming. In total, under the preferred alternative, about 2.5 million acres would be off the table for consideration for new rights-of-way, and about 1.6 million acres would have been denied any type of access for grazing, oil and gas development, trona, those sorts of things. By the way, Wyoming's the largest trona producer in the nation, the largest coal producer in the nation, and one of the largest oil and gas producers in the nation. So these issues are extremely important to us. That would have been an increase of more than 480% in acreage off limits to important things like power lines, pipelines, and maintaining roads. And this proposal would also heavily restrict trona mining as well as oil and natural gas development, which are key contributors to our economy. We learned from a former BLM employee that this proposed alternative took a very short time to develop. It was Alternative B. And he said all of their efforts and the $8 million that they spent on this effort was actually focused on developing Alternative D as in dog, compared to Alternative B as in boy. In his words, he said in coming up with alternatives B and C, B basically denying access, management, and use to the vast majority of these lands, we sat down and in 1 week they developed them together. And so over the years, they spent years developing Alternative D and about a week on B and C. Yet, because of this administration, Alternative B was the one that was chosen by the BLM. And having been someone who's dealt with NEPA for decades now, NEPA requires you to take a hard look at the alternatives and the decision that is going to be made. Would you agree with me that spending years on Alternative D as compared to 1 week on Alternative B demonstrates that the BLM never did take a hard look at Alternative B before deciding that that was the plan that they were going to go forward with?
Congresswoman, I'm not aware of these assertions by a former BLM employee, but certainly agree that NEPA requires us to take that hard look, and we will do that across all land management planning efforts, including the Rock Springs RMP.
Okay, well, would you agree spending years on something would be considered a hard look, and where spending a week on something probably wouldn't qualify?
Again, Congresswoman, I'm not aware of the assertions by this former employee, so I would hesitate to speculate, but I am certain that on the Rock Springs RMP, we did take that hard look that NEPA requires in compliance with the law.
Okay, and really, in large part, you're avoiding my question because you recognize that spending a week on Alternative B isn't most likely going to pass court muster, especially when the $8 million in the years were spent on studying Alternative D. So I just want to make sure that the BLM truly understands the implications of what happens when decisions are coming out of Washington, D.C., rather than the local offices, and rather than in conjunction with the state and the stakeholders that actually know how to manage the resources in Wyoming. It's extremely damaging when you have an environmental agenda coming out of D.C. that don't really understand, the folks who don't understand how to manage those resources, what it can do to not only a state like Wyoming, but actually the country as a whole. The war on coal, the war on oil and gas, the war on affordable energy is affecting everyone in this country. It's why I've introduced the Energy Poverty Prevention and Accountability Act, because I want to make sure that agencies like the BLM are actually having to quantify the costs associated with the decisions that they make. I think the American people deserve that, and I will again say, I think that the BLM needs to come to the table with the state of Wyoming and come up with a legitimate resource management plan for not only the Rock Springs district, but the remainder of Wyoming that BLM controls. So with that, I yield back.